Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started before it gets too late here. So I'll just do the preliminaries real quick. This is the beginning evening of the 16th Annual Brattleboro Literary Festival. This year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, BCTV, Downtown Brattleboro Alliance, The Hatch, Tim Mayo, the Stepanski Family Charitable Trust, the Thompson Trust, the Vermont Arts Council, Vermont Community Foundation, Vermont Humanities Council, Vermont Public Radio, and the Wyndham Foundation. We would also like to thank our advertisers and encourage you to support them. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, but has very real expenses, so we encourage you to make a donation to one of the donation boxes sometime this weekend or online at our website, which is brattleboro.literaryfestival.org. So please take a moment to silence your devices, turn off the ringers and so forth, but you can use them to take photos and post them to the Literary Festival social media sites. VT Bookfest, at VT Bookfest is the Twitter, Brattleboro Lit Fest is the Instagram, and Facebook, just do a search and you'll come up with it. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Robert Watson. I just had pleasure of spending about an hour with him, Tony Stepanski and their friends, Fanny and Al Franco, at a restaurant, and I wish you could have all been there. It was an incredible hour of lively discussion about history and presidents.
It was a very lively discussion.
And all sorts of things.
A lot of wine, screaming.
So at any rate, we're going to extend the conversation tonight. Robert Watson is the author of 40 books, yes, 40, which include both nonfiction, 3 novels, contributions to encyclopedia sets, and hundreds of scholarly journal articles. You must have started when you were like 5 years old. I don't see how you got 40 books. His most recent book, published this past August, is The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, which is a recovered, largely unknown history from the American Revolution. It brilliantly recounts the sordid tale of a deadly prison where American soldiers, or as the British like to call them, the rebels, were held in captivity during much of the war. Because the Brits were fighting on American enemy soil, there were not enough land-based prisons to put the captured soldiers, so His Majesty's Navy would hulk or hollow out an old battleship to hold the prisoners. There were at least 17 ships converted in this way, but one called the Jersey was the most infamous, or better known by its prisoner occupants as the Hell, or Hell Afloat. The Jersey was moored in Wallabout Bay, meaning bend in the harbor in Dutch, off the coast of Brooklyn, and with its 1,000 prisoners locked away in a dark, dank hull. The ship was originally designed to hold only 400. This particular floating prison also counted for most of the deaths, so much so that its legend echoed into the next century. In 1846, Walt Whitman, in a newspaper article, called the deaths aboard the Jersey a vast and silent army of ghosts scattered in the shallow graves along the Brooklyn waterfront. An average of 6 to 12 soldiers died each day from diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, yellow fever, typhoid, polluted water, and sadistic treatment by the prison guards. As a deterrent, the British used the horrific stature of the prison ship as psychological warfare to frighten American soldiers. But it had the opposite effect, as the ship's reputation became a rallying point for the American cause. Dr. Watson relates the Jersey story through primary sources, newspapers, military reports, and from the most compelling documents, the words of prisoners who lived in its terror and had escaped later in their lives to write down their experiences. This book was not an easy read, but was one I could not put down. At midway point, I started an inventory of words used to describe the ship and its inhabitants. They are disgusting, dark and filthy, putrid, noxious, rat-infested, diseased, pallid, violent, wretched, rotted, pestilent, lice, vermin. You get the idea. It has been calculated that over 11,500 men died on board the Jersey, which is twice the number of American soldiers who fell in combat in the Revolutionary War. As I said, the story is told from the point of view of 5 soldiers who wrote their memoirs later in life at the behest of their families. These men at the time of their capture ranged in age 12 to adult. The book tells a story of courage in the face of man's inhumanity man, and especially surprising as it was perpetrated by the great continental power against its own people in the colonies. Besides the prisoners, there's also a story of heroic American citizens who put their lives on line to help the prisoners. People like Elizabeth Burgeon, a mother of 3, probably a war widow, who delivered food to the prisoners and risked contracting diseases aboard the ship, and not considering the great danger she made for herself, Elizabeth hatched a plan to help some prisoners escape, which caused her to become a fugitive with a bounty on her head. And we don't know much about her. She was lost to history. Dr. Watson is the Director of American Studies at Florida's Lynn University. His 2 previous books are The Nazi Titanic, The Incredible Untold Story of a Doomed Ship in World War II, and America's First Crisis, the War of 1812. Because of his immense expertise on American history, he's been a commentator for CNN, MSNBC, BBC, and serves as a political analyst for the NBC affiliate station in Florida. And I think I'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well. His off-campus work also includes community activism. He founded 3 nonprofit think tanks dedicated to civic education, political reform, and fact-checking campaign lies, which I'm sure worked overtime.
We have been very busy.
27 and still are, I'm sure.
Every day.
He's the founding editor of the journal White House Studies and both directs and edits Report to the First Lady, which is presented to the First Lady in White House every 4 years after inauguration. And maybe he'll say a few words about that too. So please welcome Robert Watson to Brattleboro.
Thank you, Jerry, Tony, Sandy, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. Congratulations to everyone, the committee, the participants, and the whole town on the long-term success of this wonderful literary festival. I had a chance to walk around the town earlier today, and I was delighted to see that I believe there are more bookstores than there are banks. And I think second place was bakeries. So whenever there's more bookstores and bakeries than banks, that means it's a good town, quality of life. I also wanted to say, before I get into my remarks, that I think events like this are more important today than maybe they've ever been because of the troubled times in which we live. The written word is more important today than perhaps ever. In the face of declining readership rates today, what we could all agree would be the dumbing down of America today. Because of that, we need the written word now more than ever. I think we could also say that the rise of reality TV, Twitter, and too many Kardashians, we need the written word now more than ever. Also torn straight out of the pages of George Orwell's 1984 or Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, we're living through a time when the real news is called fake and the fake news is called real. And at best, we have fact-optional politics today. So for all those reasons, I think events like this, where we come together, those of us that love the written word, readers and writers, and we continue to do the work that we do. So thank you for what you've done here in Brattleboro, and I'm honored to be here. The late, great Librarian of Congress, Daniel Borston, spent a career reminding us that, quite simply, there's more we don't know than we do know about history, and it's not even close. One of my political heroes, Harry Truman, was fond of the saying, quote unquote, "The only thing new in this world is the history that you haven't read." And on that note, my last several books, which Jerry mentioned, have been about hidden history. That's my sweet spot, to try to dig up and find the stories that maybe we've missed or the stories that we've misinterpreted in history. Here's one way to look at it. The lion's share of books that have ever been written are gone, decomposed, destroyed, burned, or maybe destroyed on purpose, which is a whole nother lecture. Which means whether we go back 200 years or 2,000 years to try to make sense of our history, we're working with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% of the written record. Which to my mind means that well over 90% of history, probably 99% of history, we don't know, we never will know. And it's not just the loss of books that makes being an historian so challenging. It's this: we've also lost the things that make us distinctly human. those artifacts that breathe life into the human narrative and the human adventure. Love letters, poems, recipes, musical scores. Absent that, we're basically writing and teaching history without the humans in them. Are you like me? You love history, but you hated your history classes? Because we took the humans out of them, didn't we? It was dry, they were sterile. Why take the love and loss and the triumphs and tragedies out of history to make it sterile? But that's essentially what we do. So that's our challenge, is to try to make sense of the human narrative with such a limited amount of documents. In that respect, being an historian is not unlike being a paleontologist. So a paleontologist studies what? Ancient life, T-Rex. The problem for the paleontologist is all the soft parts of history have disappeared. That would be, we don't know what color T-Rex was. The skin hasn't made it. Was T-Rex green? Did T-Rex have stripes or spots? Maybe feathers? We don't know. What did T-Rex sound like? We don't know. The throat is decomposed. Spielberg recorded a train horn or something for Jurassic Park. That's what we assume it sounded like, right? I guess it works. We don't know what T-Rex smelled like, which is probably a good thing, right? Because all the soft parts of history have disappeared. All that we have left are the hard parts of history. A claw, a tooth, and maybe a dried footprint in the Cretaceous mud. Now, good luck reconstructing T-Rex's hunting, sleeping, mating habits based on a claw, a tooth, and a footprint. So we probably know less than 1% of the way T-Rex lived his or her life. As to how T-Rex mated, the answer would be very carefully, okay? Mrs. T-Rex was a lot bigger than Mr. T-Rex. It was sort of the reverse sexual dimorphism. But history's the same way, because we've lost the soft parts of history. We've lost the personal narrative and experiences. All we have left are the hard parts of history, the castles, the cannons, and the crowns. That's why we all write about it. Historians cherry pick the easy stuff. So what I like to do, and I think our challenge, is to try to dig up and uncover the human stories that we've all missed. So how do we go about doing that? Of course, the great resource for historians are letters, old letters. If you essentially want to know what I do for a living, it's two things. I spend months reading lots and lots and lots of really, really old letters. And then I come and tell stories about them or write stories about them. That's basically what I do for a living. But how reliable are the letters? Here's the problem. The lion's share of people who have ever lived have been illiterate. So for us today, that means they're invisible. If you don't write your story down, you might as well have never been born. We don't know who they were, what they did, because they were illiterate. Not only is that a problem, but women's history becomes even more problematic, because the lion's share of women who ever lived were illiterate. So it's only been about the past quarter century that we've even taken a systematic or serious look at half the population. So we're just scratching the surface there. Think about it this way. The average woman was illiterate, so we just don't know her story. Let's say that a pioneering woman who went west in the westward expansion happened to be literate. Well, how would she have written down her story? Here's the other thing historians do a poor job of telling. Paper or parchment or a quill or something to write with and write on, it was exceedingly rare and prohibitively expensive. So if she was literate when she went west, how would she have gotten something to write with and on? Let's say she happened to be literate and happened by some stretch to get something to write with or on. Who would have had the time to write? Could you imagine living in a sod house in hostile Indian territory 150 years ago without disposable diapers, a microwave oven, Walmart, or wherever it is you go, right? Who would have had time? It was a 24/7 job, 40–50% infant mortality rates. Who would have had the time to write something down? If she was literate, if she had something to write with and on, if she happened to find a little bit of time, how could she have preserved it? Paper or parchment back then was not treated with all the chemicals that it is today. Even if you take the little flyer I handed out or a piece of paper of your program, if you go put it in the grass out here and come back in 2–3 months, it's soiled. Imagine back then. And of course, we didn't have no humidity libraries and alligator Ziploc bags and archivists. You were living in a house that when it was cold and when it rained, the rain came in, the cold blew in, bugs, humidity, everything decomposed. If she was literate, if she found something to write on, if she found the time, if it managed to survive, what man would see fit to preserve it? up until the past quarter century, if you were getting your PhD at the University of Vermont in history, and you went to your dissertation committee and said, you know, I have an idea for a dissertation that's never been done before, the whole committee will lean forward. And then you say, it's something that's very important about human history. It's going to shed light on the human experience. Now they lean there on the edge of their seat. And you say, I'm going to write about recipes in the 1700s. And they're all going to go, hell no. You're going to write about either the Constitution or the Civil War, because that's what we all do. So we don't even know half the population's experiences, letters. Now, what we do have, for example, is we were fortunate that George Washington was a rather prolific letter writer, and of course, talk about a front row seat to history. And George left letters behind, and I think I've read all of them, I think we all do. But here's the problem there. One, George was poorly educated, poorly traveled, made one trip outside of the US when he was a teenager. He went to Barbados for a few days because his older half-brother Lawrence had tuberculosis. George was not well read, unlike the other founders. And George was a phonetic speller, which means he would spell phonetic with an F, right? So if you add all that up, how good are George's letters? But here's the real problem. When George finds out that he's the greatest man of his times, he wins the Revolutionary War, creates a brand new nation, a new experiment of buying for democracy, George has one of those moments where he says, oh my goodness. Think about all those poorly written letters. George had a volcanic temper. When I said stupid stuff, we don't have to worry about it, but kids today, in another 30, 40 years, when they're our age, they're going to say, wow, I can't believe I posted that on Facebook. Right. It seemed to be a smart idea. That tattoo seemed to sound good at 19, but at 55 or whatever, it doesn't sound so good. George had one of those moments. So we had a Harvard-educated aide named Tobias Lear, as in King Lear, who worked for him. He sent Lear around Tidewater, Virginia, to meet with the former members of the Continental Congress and find his officers and collect his letters. Lear would say, I'm here on behalf of the general, he wants his letter back. So, oh, I think this just went off, didn't it? All right. Well, can you hear me? I'm pretty loud. Yeah. Okay, all right. So Lear would collect all the letters. Then what they did is they brought them back to Mount Vernon, and with the help of Lear and Hamilton, they rewrote them and then re-delivered them. So when I'm working with a George letter, I will call, there was a guy named Ed Langell at Virginia who was the keeper of the Washington letters. I would call him or someone like him and say, hey, I've got this George letter from whatever the year. I need to know, is it the real thing or is it 2.0? And Ed or whomever would go, I don't know. And then I would go, I don't know. And we would, thank you. Star, right? Thank you. So we don't know. We don't know if that letter, can you hear me? Yeah. We don't know if the letter's legitimate or not. So who knows? Here's the other problem. George Washington died on December 14th, 1799. His wife, Martha, lived until May of 1802. There are a lot more letters there when George dies, a lot less letters when Martha dies. So what happened? We assume she burned them. That was rather common at the time. We also know that Mrs. W. was intensely private. She served out of a sense of duty, but when George was gone, she just wanted to be left alone. So we think she burned the letters. So that raises the next quandary. Did Martha burn the letters systematically, randomly, haphazardly? My guess is on systematically. So my guess is this. If she found a letter where George says, my wife is my anchor, she is a rock during the storm of the revolution, Martha says, that's a keeper. If she found a letter that said, my neighbor, Sally Fairfax, my God, is she hot. When she bends over when she's gardening, that probably went in the fireplace, right? So I don't know. So maybe we're only getting the better George letters. Who knows? The answer is, we don't know. Jefferson, if ever there was a letter writer, Jefferson left behind thousands of letters. Jefferson, of course, had the pen of a Walt Whitman, a brilliant writer. If you've been to Monticello, there's a draftsman's table at an angle like this, and he has two quills hooked up to a pulley system. So whatever he wrote down, another quill wrote a copy. It was the first copy machine. The reason Jefferson did this, he would mail one letter and keep the other one. Jefferson was a megalomaniac,
And he didn't trust the person he was mailing the letter to preserve his brilliance so we could read it in 200 years. So Jefferson would preserve his own so we would read about how smart he was. But that's not the problem. Here's the problem. There are references in letters from Madison, Monroe, and some of Jefferson's closest associates that Jefferson would fudge and change the date on his letters. So, he was president from 1801 to 1809, our third president. Madison was his Secretary of State. Let's say in 1805, Madison does something pretty incredible. Jefferson would write a letter saying, if only Madison would do this, I think it would save the peace. And he would write 1806 on a letter, but he would write 1801 on the letter, but he actually wrote it a year later. So he would put an earlier date. So we're reading his letters going, how did this guy know the lottery numbers, right? So I will call one of the Jefferson scholars and say, hey, I got a letter from TJ. I need to know if it's real or fudged. And what would they say to me? I don't know. And what do I say? I don't know. We don't know. So how reliable are even the letters? Well, what we have is we have paintings. But how reliable are the paintings? First off, only the wealthiest of the wealthy of the wealthy had their portraits painted. You had traveling artists, and in the court, or a great wealthy family would have a court or their own appointed scholar, their own portrait painter, and their own whatever, right? Now, throughout history, most people did not eat a meal every day. We don't do a good job of telling that story. You have countless accounts that I've read from soldiers from multiple wars who said they joined the war so they could get a meal every day. Because they didn't eat every day. 3 meals a day, only the pharaohs had that. So what you would have is most people didn't have their portraits painted. The court would hire an official scholar and an official painter. So if you're the court scholar, you get to live in the castle. That's a pretty good gig. What you have to do is regale people with stories at a party and then educate the king and queen's kids. So do you think the scholars gave those kids a B? Hell no. They gave them straight A's because you don't want to get fired. You want to tell the king and queen your kid is brilliant, by the way. And then they say, let's keep him on board. And then if the king says, I want you to paint my kids and me and my wife, you paint Jennifer Aniston and George Clooney, don't you? And the king goes, that's a heck of a likeness. We're going to keep this guy around. So how accurate were the paintings? Maybe you put some abs on the king, right? The king is always pictured riding into battle. Do you think the kings went into battle? No, they were back at the castle with the turkey leg and a mistress or something, right? So, and you paint the king's children. So how accurate are the paintings? Probably not very accurate. There are lots of George Washington paintings that survive. George was a big guy, this we know. But if you look at some of the paintings, he towers over cannons, horses, and battlefields. He would be about 10 to 12 feet tall if you extrapolated. I mean, he would have made Shaq look little, basically. So we need to make George big to imbue our nation with its founding myths, right? George had to be 6'2" in a day and age when men were half a foot smaller, right? How do we know he was 6'2"? His doctor, Dr. Craig, left 2 medical reports behind. In one he says George is 6'1", and in one he says he's 6'3". So we split the difference. The other thing we know is Craig was a lousy physician, right? He couldn't even measure his patients. So what do we really know? Not much. What do we really know about the Revolutionary War? Not a lot. We think we know everything. Every school kid can tell you about the Boston Tea Party. Every school kid can tell you about Paul Revere's Midnight Ride because of the magnificent Longfellow poem. Great poem, horrendous history, by the way. It's inaccurate. So what do we really know about the Revolution? We don't even know what the bloodiest single conflict or battle of the entire Revolution was. It's disappeared, we've lost it, we've forgotten it. Jerry mentioned it in his opening. The single bloodiest conflict of the Revolution was not Saratoga or Yorktown, Lexington, Concord, Breeds Hill, Bunker Hill. The single bloodiest conflict of the Revolution occurred on a wretched, rotting prison ship 100 yards off the Brooklyn coast, when twice as many Americans died on this one ghostly prison ship than died in combat during the entirety of the Revolution. That's a whopper of a statistic, isn't it, everyone? I have trouble getting my brain around it, but it's true. So it's remarkable what had happened on that ship. How did this come to be? The short answer is this. I apologize for mentioning his name, rotten person, good filmmaker, and that would be Mel Gibson. Y'all remember The Patriot? I like the movie. It's loosely based on the story of Francis Marion from South Carolina, who was the swamp fox. And there were scenes in the movie that the critics really poo-pooed. They really hit Gibson for it. Do you remember there was a scene when they got innocent Americans and they locked them in a church and they burned the church to the ground? Y'all remember that scene? And then there was a cavalry officer called the Green Dragon. His real name was Bannister Tarleton. He was a real guy. He would shoot children and women and burn farms. And the critics said, this is impossible. Gibson is infatuated with blood. This didn't happen. The British, after all, were gentlemen. And they fought a prim and proper war. Baloney. The movie was accurate. There's no such thing as a prim and proper war. War is hell. All wars have been hell. I had, fortunately, the book's been reviewed by the New York Times and a bunch of prominent. I'd say 95% of the reviews have been very solid, so we're happy about that. One reviewer for the Wall Street Journal, however, actually a professor of history at my alma mater, interestingly enough, really liked the book and recommended it, but he said Watson does use hyperbole, and he exaggerated. He said that the prison ships were a place of blood and hell, and that these wardens that oversaw the ships had a near bloodlust. He said, no, the British were gentlemen and they would fight a prim and proper war. Well, I'll let you be the judge. Let me tell you about the prison wardens. There was an Irishman named Cunningham. There was a Scot named David Sproat. Here's what William Cunningham would do. When he was bored, maybe once a week, he would get about a half dozen prisoners. He'd have the guards take them out at night. He'd sit in a chair for entertainment, and he'd have them torture them until the prisoner died. He wanted to watch. If the prisoner was dying too slowly and he got bored, he'd finish him off with a bullet in the head or stab him in the heart. He did that. He killed 250 prisoners during the war because he was bored and wanted to watch this. Let me tell you what else William Cunningham, the proper English officer, did. When wives and mothers and daughters would come to give an apple or a coat, because if you don't have a coat and it's winter, almost all the prisoners died in the winter. Winter in New York City with a shirt with holes in it, almost everyone died of frostbite and elements. A mother, a wife, a daughter would bring an apple and a coat. What Cunningham would do is he would make all the prisoners line up and watch. He would strip the woman, put her on a post, and whip her. And then he would take the clothing or the apple for himself. Who does this? Sproat, who was the commissary or the warden of the ghost ship. David Sproat, at one time, they organized a prisoner exchange. It was around 400 Americans for around 400 Brits. Sproat tells the Americans, look, no hard feelings, even though they had been tortured and mass murdered. He's going to give them a last meal. And he does this under the guise as I want you to say good things about me so they don't come for my head soon. They get a last meal. They're put on a schooner to sail away. Unbeknownst to them, Sproat laced the meal with poison. Almost every one of the men died on the way home. Sproat wrote about this, and I found his war reports in the Imperial War Museum in London. And the handful of prisoners that lived described what had happened. So, prim and proper? Hardly. Bloodthirsty? Yeah. They reminded me of, and I don't say this lightly, my last book was on the Holocaust. They reminded me of concentration camp commandants at times. This is how bad it was. So what was life like on this ghostly ship? First off, the ship was built in 1736, and she was a marvel to behold. Over 140 feet long, multiple decks, multiple masts. She had a crew of 400, carried over 60 cannons, including the biggest cannons of the day. So she was a weapon of mass destruction. She was agile, fast, and powerful. One of the most impressive warships of the age. However, she was cursed. Her captain dies. Multiple diseases tear through her hulls. She loses about every battle she's in. She fights off the coast of Cuba, Brazil, and Colombia, and loses just about every battle. She fought in the War of Jenkins' Ear. You're probably thinking he's making this stuff up. There really was a War of Jenkins' Ear, and I think there's a lesson. There was a British captain who was in Spanish waters when he wasn't supposed to be. His name was Jenkins. The Spanish captain caught him and cut his ear off. Jenkins pickled the ear, took it before Parliament and showed him the ear. Unfortunately, the British and Spanish were governed by adolescent hotheads who went to war over the dang ear, if you could imagine something like that. So this ship is cursed. Cursed. Nobody wants to be on a crew. To the point where 40 years later, in the 1770s, she's 4 decades old, she's well past her prime. Rather than retrofit or renovate her, because she's rotting, because she's cursed, they just let her go. But she would have one more mission. That would be the Revolutionary War. After the Declaration of Independence is signed and read to the troops in July of '76, the British decide enough of these pesky rebels. We're going to end this. So General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe set sail from England with the largest expeditionary force to ever leave English shores at the time, over 32,000 men, along with 9,000 Hessians. Those were the Germanic soldiers of fortune, the biggest, most feared soldiers on earth, in a flotilla of warships and supply ships, and they headed to New York City. The Jersey's part of it. Now, she doesn't sail with cannons. They stripped her cannons. She's demoted to being a supply ship. She's filled with powder and flour and cows, things like that. She sails to New York. Now, Howe wants a toehold and an operating command post. He's going to make New York City that. George Washington guesses that Howe's going to New York City. So George goes and digs in with about 10,000 men. Earthworks, trenches, picket lines, and he's waiting for Howe. The problem for George is, as we all know, New York City has way too many water access points. He can try to block everyone, but he can't block everything. He left a bit of beachhead open on Staten Island and Long Island. That would be Long Island, if there's any locals in the audience. So, and the British, Howe gets a toehold there, and he annihilates Washington. You've heard of the Battle of Brooklyn, or Brooklyn Heights? It's devastating for Washington. They have to flee at night across the river into Manhattan, leaving campfires lit to trick Howe, thinking that they're there at night. Howe crosses the next day, chases Washington up through Manhattan. He's annihilating the army. Washington goes all the way to White Plains. It's apparent that Howe and the Hessians are going to follow him and continue. Washington tries to trick them and throw them off his scent by swinging around and heading south. He cuts through the state of New Jersey. I imagine the turnpike tolls were hell, right? But fortunately, Christie wasn't the governor because the bridges were open, okay? Washington was able to get out and cross the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where he set up camp at the end of the year. You all know about the crossing of the Delaware. That's where that comes in. Meanwhile, back in New York City, Howe leaves the Hessians to block Washington at Delaware. He left a Hessian colonel by the name of Johann Gottlieb Rahl, who was known as the Hessian Lion. Big guy with a bald head and a peacock demeanor. Reminds me of Yul Brynner in The King and I, has that kind of look. Rahl was a monster. What the Hessians did, whenever they caught Americans who couldn't keep up, they would bayonet them to trees, remove the gun and leave the bayonet in the guy, so corpses were hanging off trees. They would also capture men and make the rest watch while they would hang the guy. Right when he was ready to die, they'd cut the rope. And then when he thought he was okay, they'd re-hang him and then cut the rope. Then re-hanging and then cut the rope, and they would bet on it. So this is the kind of prim and proper revolution that the textbooks don't really cover. So meanwhile, back in New York City, General Howe was a problem. We had burned about 40% of the city when we left. There's only 2 prisons in the city. So Howe confiscates some Dutch churches, takes the pews out, uses them for firewood, but even with that, he can only accommodate a few hundred. Howe has over 4,000 prisoners. He believes the war will end in weeks, so why spend the time, energy, or resources? Howe says, instead of building prisons, we're going to hawk warships. To hawk a ship means you take the rudder, the masts, the anchor, the steer house, you take everything off. So it is literally a floating box, a floating coffin. They would moor them with cables off the bow and stern, and they put them 100 yards off the Brooklyn coast. Not New York City proper, because they knew the disease would go ashore and wipe out the British command. Plus loyalists and royalists, the pro-British folk from around the colonies, were all racing to stay in New York. So nobody gave a darn about Brooklyn. A couple of Dutch farmers, that's it. And there they put the boats. Now something happened. They put roughly 1,000 men on the Jersey, this ghost ship, Hell, as Jerry said, about 1,000 men, and they all die. And that's when the British got an idea, a remarkably contemporary idea, which I think completely turns our notions of British warfare circa 18th century on its head. This is what they said: let's use the ship as a psychological weapon of terror. So many men will die on that ship, it's so rotted, the disease, the smell, that we will announce through loyalist pamphlets, newspapers, and town criers, hear ye, that if you colonials, if you pick up arms against us, and if you're caught, you're going to hell, you're going to the ghost ship. And there's only one way off the ship. Now, long story short, the British thought that would deter us from fighting and it would end the war. It had the opposite effect. As some young boys and others managed to escape the ship and live to tell their tale, as people heard about the horrors, they were outraged. It ended up building support for the cause of liberty. This ship played a role during the war that the Boston Massacre played before the war. I found references where sailors would go into combat and they would be screaming, "Remember hell." Decades later, we'd yell, "Remember the Alamo," right, everybody? So it rallied support for the cause of liberty. Conditions on the ship. Every morning, the routine was the same. The guards would hammer down the hatch, and then they boarded up the portholes. So there was no oxygen in this coffin. A lot of the men that died not just because of disease or a lack of food, they died of asphyxiation. The few that lived, one of them described trying to light a candle below deck, and he couldn't get the match lit or the candle lit because there was no air. On average, every day, 365 days a year, year after year, between 6 and 12 men died per night. Every morning, the guards would tear open the hatch and yell, "Rebels, bring up your dead." And they'd bring 6 to 12 up. They would put the men on what they called a dead boat, a little launch. They would get 2 or 3 of the prisoners to row it ashore and bury, all of them under armed guard. They would row 100 yards ashore and throw the bodies in shallow graves. The men that were on the dead boat detail and the men that would peek through a slat or from the deck and watch this said that day in and day out, year in and year out, the prisoners were only allowed to throw 1, 2, or 3 shovels of sand over the bodies. The bodies were still exposed before they were bayoneted back onto the dead boat to row back to the ghost ship. As they're rowing back, or those from the ship would look, and every day the macabre play would play out. Wild hogs, dogs, coyotes, buzzards would come out and eat the prisoners. At the next high tide, the bones would wash out and be gone. Even if you ate, you would die. The prisoners were given about 2/3 of the ration, the caloric intake that you needed to stay alive. So if you didn't eat, you died. If you ate, you died a little slower. The food itself was problematic. They would have greenish meat that was rotted. The prisoners said they would try to boil it so they could get it past their nose to eat it. They would have a porridge and a hard tack. This would be a hard bread that would have the consistency of the heel of your shoe. They had to boil it, otherwise they would lose a tooth, and when they boiled it, all the bugs would come out, although most of them resorted to drinking the water with the bugs because it was protein. The problem with trying to cook the food is they had what they called the great copper, a big kettle thing that they would boil. Now, the British used 2 sources of water. They would send guards ashore to find a creek and put that in a casket. That would be the water source for the crew. The water for the prisoners, they would drop a bucket overboard. The water in Wallabout Bay was putrid, smelly. It was more like a mud flat. Don't forget there's bodies in it, there's vomit, there's urine, there's the bilge pumps. So if you didn't drink, you died. If you drank the water, you would die. They used that water in the Great Copper. What men would do with a fish hook, a string, a ladle, or the little copper cup that they had, they would put their meat in there and boil it for as long as they could in order to get it a little bit cooked. Or they would hold a cup of porridge over or the hardtack to soften it a little so they could eat it. The problem was the cook. The prisoners called the cook His Majesty the Cook. And what he would do is he would stand at the Great Copper with a ladle, And as the men would try to boil their food, he would throw scalding water in their face to blind them. The weakest, the oldest, the youngest would be at the end of the line. As people were moving through the line, the cook would ring the bell, no more food. So those in the end of the line went hungry and died the fastest. There was a big tub that they used for feces and urine. It was an open tub below decks. Open, you can imagine the smell and the disease. Now, with 1,000 to 1,200 men below decks, they were literally on top of one another, which meant that the weakest, the oldest, the sickest, there was nowhere to bunk. They would have to bunk around the tub and actually bunked in urine and feces. Every few days, the guards would say it's time to empty the tub. Nobody wanted to empty the tub. Why? If you were picked, you had to carry the tub up a ladder. Of course, everything would spill out. And if you were covered with it, you would not be able to bathe. The next time it rained, if you were lucky enough to be on top deck, you could wash this out of your hair and off your skin. If not, you just wore feces and urine. They would dump the tub overboard, and then the guards would drop the bucket in it to get the day's water rations. So if you ate, you died. If you drank, you died. If you didn't eat or drink, you died. In other words, you died. It was hard for these men to, if you just walked in, this is on the Revolutionary War prisoners. It was hard for these men to keep their spirits up. A handful of things encouraged them. You heard Jerry tell the story of a woman who risked her life. There was another woman who risked her life. Her name was Dame Grant. Mrs. Grant was described as a very portly older woman, and every once in a while she'd have local boys row her out to the ghost ship. She would bring thread, tobacco, needle, a pipe, an apple, and she would barter or sell or give it to the guards. If the guards dealt with her, she would say, you have to give it to the prisoners. If the guards didn't allow the prisoners to buy or get anything, she just stopped coming. Now, it was hell for the guards, too. So they wanted Dame Grant to come. 95% of the men, 99% of the men probably never got a thread or an apple or anything from Dame Grant. But they couldn't wait for her to show up because she probably reminded them of a mother or a grandmother. What she reminded them of was life before and the hope of life after the war. Normalcy. Unfortunately, by boarding the ship, Dame Grant caught one of the diseases and died. Then they captured and brought on board a Virginian who was a lay preacher who they called the orator. He would climb up on deck when they were allowed on deck and stand on the side and give these impassioned speeches, inspiring the men to live. But he also criticized Sproat, Cunningham, Joshua Loring, these wardens. And the men begged him to stop because the British were getting tired of him. Sure enough, one day, Sproat, the one who poisoned people, shows up with armed guards, grabs the orator and takes him off the ship. He was never heard of again. The prisoners who lived said that they believed Sproat took him ashore and put a bullet in his head. That probably is what happened. We don't know. That's as good a guess as any. There was another thing that gave the men inspiration, and that was on the 4th of July at the end of the war. The men each would save a little bit of food that was not immediately perishable, maybe a small piece of hardtack. They would only, each night with their little cup, they would be given a ration of water. Maybe they only drank half of it, so they saved half. With the thread and needle that Dame Grant brought, with some of the clothing items of the men that had died, they made little flags. So on Independence Day, when they were allowed on the top deck, all the men got out their little ration of water, their little bit of hardtack, and their flags, and they exchanged, and they had a sip and a bite together. And then they sang patriotic songs. And the guards told them to quiet. So the men sang louder. And the guards told them to quiet. So the men sang louder. And then the guards opened up. With swords and bayonets, they hacked their way through defenseless skeletons, driving the men below decks and hammering the hatch. They were left down there a day and a night in July. When they finally opened it, everybody's dead or dying. So it became apparent to the men the only way to get off this ghost ship is to escape. And a few did and told their tales. And the stories are, y'all remember The Great Escape, the movie? I mean, it's like that. You know, hiding by day, running by night, just harrowing, getting recaptured, fighting, just harrowing stories. One of the folks was a 13-year-old boy named Christopher Hawkins. He had the misfortune of being the youngest son of a dirt poor, illiterate family, which meant that he was sold as an indentured servant. Now, we didn't have unemployment numbers back during the Revolution, but it's safe to say that 50% of the population lost their livelihood and would have been unemployed. And that's the fate that happened to the man that Hawkins was sold to. So the man sold Hawkins to a fisherman from Rhode Island. And the fisherman decided to be a privateer. He couldn't go out and fish because the British Navy blockaded the coast and the ports. So he decided to be a privateer. A privateer is basically a government-sanctioned pirate. You get your fishing boat, you strap a cannon on it, you hire a crew of 20, 13-year-old illiterate landlubbers, and you go out. You can't fight a British warship. You couldn't take on a brig or a frigate. What you do is you hunt supply ships. And the deal was you'd sign a letter of marque or marquee, and you got to keep 80% of what you stole. The other 20% went to Uncle Sam. Now, hundreds of British supply ships are hit by these 1, 2, 3 cannon fishing boats and schooners, to the point where it's causing real damage to the British. Imagine the angry ship owners, insurance companies, and merchants who are losing ship after ship. The British had to sail the ships in convoys escorted by armed warships. The more warships that are escorting them across the Atlantic, the less warships that are hitting us and blockading the coast. So Christopher Hawkins set sail on a privateer called the Eagle. Unfortunately, one day with no winds, the sails are lying limp, and the cloud, it was stormy, the clouds are so thick and low that they're on the water, foggy. Out of the fog comes the bow over them. Hawkins described it as an apparition from hell. It was the HMS Sphinx, a large warship, which blows this little privateer out of the water. They fish little Hawkins out of the water, put him in irons, and take him to the ghost ship. Hawkins is dying. He's a skeleton. He meets another little boy his age, and the two of them plan to escape. There's a little hole in the back of the boat. By taking off their clothes and sticking their head through, they wiggle, and they plop down at night into the water. Hawkins plops in the water, and he can't find his friend. Presumably, the boy drowned. He underestimated how weak he was. Hawkins makes it ashore, and you have to read the book to get the story, but it's remarkable what he does. He ultimately makes it home, and he's such a patriot that he re-enlists to go back and fight. And he lived through the war. He moved to New York and became the mayor of a little town. And late in life, he decided to write a story and donate it to a library. And I want to give a shout out to librarians in history. Librarians for 220 years kept this manuscript. Found one at the Newport, Rhode Island, one at the Providence, Rhode Island, one in the New York Public Library, one in New London. They kept these manuscripts sitting for 220 years, and there they were to tell the story, waiting to be read. I don't know how they kept them all those years. My favorite character that I came across in this tale was a man named Thomas Dring, D-R-I-N-G. He was an officer. He's kind of like half MacGyver, half Indiana Jones, dashing professor like all professors, obviously. He's resourceful. He's about the 4th officer on a ship called the Chance. They go to sea and they end up tangling with a large British warship called the HMS Belisarius, and they're blown out of the water. What Dring does is before the ship sinks, he runs below and he gets every item of clothing and everything he can, and he double, triple dresses, sticks things in his shoes. Even though it was the summer, he knew that if he lived, it would soon be winter and he would need clothing. He could take it off, put it back on, barter. Dring's put in irons, and they take him aboard the ghost ship. Now, officers are only treated horribly. Everybody else is treated very horribly. So there's a group of 5 officers. There's a little cabin boy who's 12. His name is Palmer. And Palmer was brutally beaten and picked on the ship. My guess is sexually molested. I think that was the fate for cabin boys throughout history. We just don't tell the stories. Anyways, Palmer reminded Dring of his little brother, and Dring stoically, courageously makes the crew stop picking on Palmer. He tells the British Palmer goes with the officers, so he saved his life. They get together. Now, Dring realizes that everybody's in the grips, the throes of yellow fever and smallpox and all kinds of diseases. Now, inoculations, I read, did not come in until 1796, but there was an early form of an inoculation called a variolation. George Washington had the whole Continental Army variolated in January of 1777. Dring knew about it, so here's what he does. He finds a man that's not too advanced in his illness. He cuts his hand. Then Dring cuts his hand, the other 4 officers, and little Palmer's hand, and he infects everybody. They get sick, but they live. And over the next couple of months, when everybody on the ship died, those officers lived. Unfortunately, Palmer dies. Dring is eaten up by it. He feels responsible for what happened. Ultimately, they've got to escape because everyone's dying. So they chisel away at the back hall and they hang a cloth over it. They get a hole big enough that the 5 officers can escape. They wait for a stormy night so that no one will hear them plop in the water. The 4 officers go over. Of course, Dring goes last. As he sticks his head through, ready to go over, he hears gunshots and screams. One of the prisoners told the guards. Who? We don't know. Why? We don't know. Maybe they got an extra ration of water. Maybe they got an extra 5 minutes on the deck. Maybe they got an apple. Now they told the Hessians who were on duty, rather than arrest Dring and them, the Hessians waited until they were in the act. And they killed 3 of the 4 officers in the water. They brought the 4th one back. They hack his arm off and throw him below decks to die, with everybody watching. Dring lived. Now Dring goes to Sproat. He realizes they're never going to be able to escape. They're not going to live. He tells Sproat, you've got to let me off the ship to meet with George Washington and conduct a prisoner exchange. And let me tell you why. You're going to catch a disease sooner or later and die. Or one of these days, either the army or angry citizens are going to show up and they're going to tear you limb from limb. The war's ending and you're losing. Sproat takes the deal. He lets Dring and 2 other officers, 3 officers off the ship. The deal is, if you don't come back, I'll kill everybody on the ship. And he would. Dring meets with the big dog, George. Now, George can't do a prisoner exchange, and here's why. He had to bite the bullet and turn down prisoner exchanges. If you do 500 for 500, the British are getting back 500 professionally trained men who are soldiers and have been fed. What are we getting back? 500 illiterate teenage farmers who are skeletons and their enlistment's long over. George knew if we could win the only way to win the war was to deny the British these thousands of prisoners he had. After Yorktown, he takes 8,000 prisoners. He can't do the exchanges. There's something about Dring, though, and George agrees to the exchange. The other 2 officers run. Dring goes back to the ghost ship. And he tells everybody it's going to happen. There's a schooner coming. Now they have hope toward the end of the war. Dring catches a disease. I'm reading this going, please don't die. Come on, we've been together the whole war, please. He lived. The schooner shows up, but Sproat goes back on his word. Instead of letting everyone off, he says, only the 40 men that came from your ship, the Chance, I'm going to let off. The problem is, I think 37 of the 40 had died. So only 3 guys are getting off. So Dring makes it up that each person on board, yeah, Joe Smith is our gunner, right, Joe? Yes, sir. Bill Jones is our master's mate, right, Bill? So they pretend that they're the crew. He gets 38 guys off in himself, and then he saves, there's a little 12-year-old boy named Bidwell. Bidwell reminds Dring of his younger brother and Palmer, the kid that died. Bidwell is below decks. He's basically dead. He's hanging on. He's in throes of disease. Dring says, Bidwell's with me. He's my cabin boy. The men that are being saved protest because Bidwell is so diseased, he's going to give everyone on the Freedom ship a disease and they're all going to die on the way home. But Dring's insistent. He orders the captain to race to Providence. They're in a race for time because Bidwell's on his last gasp. Bidwell, though, inspires the freed prisoners. He tells them, it doesn't matter if I die. I have stars overhead. I took a breath of fresh air. I'll die with fresh air in my lungs. The men are thinking, who is this stoic 12-year-old kid? So Dring is helping to sail the ship. They race back to Providence. Bidwell's on his last breath. And the people of Providence realize the ship is from the ghost ship. So they quarantine it. No one off. That night, Dring steals the captain's launch, lowers it in the water, and takes Bidwell off. He rows ashore, finds 2 local boys, and has them race to find the Bidwell family. The family comes back, and Bidwell died right before the family arrived. I told my publicist and publisher that I can't make this crap up. I'm nowhere nearly that good. Maybe some of your novel writers. I'm not that creative. Can you imagine? In closing, this was one of America's most tragic maritime disasters. Many, 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 many more people die on this one ship than died on the Titanic. It's one of America's great military, the unthinkable disasters. Yet we've forgotten it. Folks that study the Holocaust and survivors talk about never forget, never again. If we don't remember and teach every generation the lesson of never again, we'll repeat it. With POWs, we talk about lest we forget. But here's the problem, guys. We've forgotten. Every culture, every country, every conflict in history, the one constant is prisoners of war are treated horribly. Whether it's the Nazis or the Japanese during World War II and what they did, whether it was the Confederacy during the Civil War and what they did to Union prisoners, whether it was ISIS, prisoners of war are treated miserably. Rarely do they have rights. Rarely do we treat them as soldiers rather than as rebels. Unlike the president, I like soldiers even if they're captured. We have to honor the prisoners and always remember these stories so that the words, lest we forget, actually have meaning. Thank you. Ma'am.
You began this whole talk by discussing the stories that we don't know.
Right.
The women, the illiterate, and so forth. And we have a sort of a local hero, Lucy Terry Prince. And I guess the Literary Festival this weekend is actually, there's one of the things that's going to be happening is that there's going to be a performance of someone playing her part. And I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's one of the earliest known African-American writers.
Oh.
But what she's known for writing was this ballad that was actually, a ballad that was just passed on by being sung. And so I think some of the stories that were not written down, we've been able to preserve through ballads. And I wonder if that's something that you've been able to find in your research.
Song, poetry, oral traditions, everyone. I taught at the University of Hawaii for 5 years before I got married, and then my wife said, we're moving to Florida. And I said yes, and yes. In Hawaii, it was an oral culture before missionaries from New England arrived there circa 1820. And the joke in Hawaii is the missionaries went there to do good and ended up doing very well. And they imposed an alphabet and things on the Hawaiian people, but most of Hawaiian culture was lost. However, in Hawaiian communities, Native Hawaiian communities, there were dances, the hula dance. There were chants. There were stories. The akumu, yep, sure. The hula, by the way, every move in the hula is storytelling. This is the clouds overhead. This is picking fruit off a tree. The more that a woman sways her hips, with each hip sway, it means further back in history. So if she does 2 or 3, it wasn't that long ago. If she does this for the whole song, it was ancient history. The guys do it by stepping forward. I tried to immerse myself in the culture, as I always do. But so we don't know much about Hawaiian history, but in the 1970s, there was a Hawaiian Renaissance. Some of the master teachers and the elders in the community decided to bring back the hula and the chants. So whether it's American Indians or cultures around the world, stories are preserved in writing, in oral custom, through religion, through ceremonies, wedding, funeral ceremonies, funeral orations and eulogies, in song. We need to explore everything we can because there's so little that survives. Yeah, thank you. And I'm pleased to hear that you're that local hero. Tony.
So you mentioned earlier that Washington's letters were rewritten,
A lot of them, yeah.
typically by an educated person?
Yeah, he had 2 people that handled most of his letters. One was Tobias Lear, who went to Harvard, was very impressive. The other one was Alexander Hamilton, who was drop dead brilliant, and also had a gift with the pen. So a lot of Washington's letters were written by them. Now Washington's writing them, but Hamilton's over his shoulder going, with respect, we say that, for example, there's a few Washington letters that circulate around synagogues around the country because Washington wrote this really touching letter to what he called the stock of Abraham, the Jewish community. And he said to them that I want you to know, you're welcome here. My commitment to religious liberty equals my commitment to political liberty. And if you read the letter, it shows that Washington has this remarkable understanding of Jewish culture and history. Washington didn't. Hamilton was raised by Sephardic shippers on the island of Nevis. Hamilton knew it. So if you read a lot of Washington's letters, there's words in there that Hamilton uses on. So either Hamilton standing over his shoulder or something. Now George wrote some of his own letters, but which ones are which, we don't know. And that's the pickle. That's the pickle. Yeah, ma'am?
How much was known about the ghost ship at the time?
How much was known about the ghost ship at the time? Here's the thing, if we could take a time machine back to the year 1780, everyone knew about it. It was infamous. For example, Christopher Hawkins, when he's running, at one point he's basically dead. A farm boy finds him. He's naked, he's starving. He thinks, oh no, I'm not far from New York, there's a loyalist community. The farm boy's mother takes him in bathes him, dresses him, feeds him. It turned out her husband died on the ship. Another person named Ebenezer Fox that gets off the ship just runs into a person, and they looked at him, they said, "Were you on the Jersey?" So people knew about it at the time. It was like the scary story mothers would tell their kids at night, now don't run off and join the Navy because you'll end up on. After the war, we forgot about it. Why did we forget about it? One, throughout history, no one wants to remember the horrible aspects of a war. You want to celebrate Ben Franklin flying a kite in Washington, crossing the Delaware, and Thomas Paine's, common sense. Nobody wants to remember everybody dies. Secondly, the far majority of prisoners died. The few that got off, many of them were illiterate. The few that lived would be a 14-year-old farmer. Who cares about their story? Nobody wants to record their story or preserve their story. And we all know someone who was a World War II vet who never talked about it. Don't we all know someone who was in the Holocaust that never talked about it? I think it wasn't really until maybe Elie Wiesel's Night, 1960, before people felt it was okay to tell your story. So there was no understanding of post-traumatic in 1780. So these boys got off and nobody wanted to think about it, nobody wanted to remember it, and shh. Thirdly, we were a new nation. We didn't even have a capital. We were in debt. Each new state was bickering. Who has time to look back? We needed to create a government and try to move forward and get out of debt. And the stories were just forgotten. Walt Whitman, who lived in Brooklyn, recalled seeing local boys go into the crypt or vault and using the skulls as like soccer balls, if you will, just kicking skulls around. And he was so outraged by it. But then what he discovered is no one knew about this. So it's circa 1780, everyone knew about it. By the time the last former prisoners died, the story just disappeared. So it's not in textbooks, it's not in song, it's not in, Lin-Manuel Miranda has not yet written a musical about it. Showboat, the sequel perhaps, I don't know. So yeah, it's been forgotten.
Love Boat.
Yeah, so crazy. I had heard of it, and for years I kicked around. I usually lay out, I try to do a book a year, and that's working every day of the year. I was typing like a fiend on the airplane here, and in my room before I went out to dinner with Jerry and Tony. I was working on another one. But I'll lay 5 books out, and invariably 4 of them I can't write, because there's no primary source materials. You might have, like Elizabeth Bergen. I'd love to tell her story, but she disappeared. She left nothing behind. We don't know anything about her. We don't know where she's buried. We don't know anything. So you could write about a paragraph, which I did, and that's it. So it's hit or miss with history. History is the cautionary science. We begin to think we know things. We don't know anything. And even if it's David McCullough or Doris Kearns Goodwin, the best in the biz, it's scraping the surface. Chernow might put a 700-page book together about Hamilton, which is magnificent. It scratches the surface. And who knows what we're missing or what he missed. So, yeah. Ma'am, Sandy.
Did a lot of prisoners commit suicide? I'm just curious.
A lot of prisoners commit suicide. Some did. There were 2 prison ships. Okay, there were several prison ships, as Jerry mentioned. The Jersey was by far the biggest. Probably as many men died on the Jersey as all the others put together, and then probably still more passed on the Jersey. 2 of the ships near it in 2 consecutive years, we believe the prisoners on board burned the ship. They burned it to the ground, burned it into the water. Did a few make it off the ship? Probably. Did most die on board? Probably. Was it self-started and suicide? Probably. I don't know anything more than that. So yeah, a few did because it was so abysmal. Men just gave up. Dring recalled his first night on board. He said that the scariest thing was in the morning when he saw all these, like The Walking Dead, people just shuffling in lunacy and in the throes of a disease, half naked, just shuffling around the holds. And they'd just given up. And when it was time to go up to get their water, they just shuffled around and then they died. So it was that wretched. Ma'am?
Isn't there a monument in Brooklyn to it? I vaguely remember.
There's one monument. It's called the Prison Ship Martyrs Memorial. It's at Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn. And it was built 100 years ago. And unfortunately, the city let it go. It had 4 beautiful eagles around it, and those were stolen. People graffitied it. Homeless people urinated in it, and it was just left to rot. Several years ago, they actually renovated it, but it's still not in that good of condition. Now, if you go there, as I do, it's a popular place where people bring their dogs to urinate on the and then that's it. So we've kind of forgotten about the memorial. They found the bones of a few thousand of the men, and some were put in a crypt. There's a black unmarked crypt about a baseball's throw away from the memorial if you go today, but the signage, everything's lacking. The rest of the bones were underground in an area, and several years ago, the city of Brooklyn approved a crappy 3-story apartment, and they built it over top of the bones, and it's there now. So I'm going back to the Brooklyn Historical Society in a month or so, and one of the things I'm going to do there is have everybody join me, and we're going to go and see that apartment building. I'm going to say, write letters to the paper, let's complain about this, and we've got to do something. We need to put adequate signage on the vault. These are patriots who have been forgotten and their ruins desecrated. So yeah, there's one, the Prison Ship Martyrs Memorial is the technical name of it, about 70 feet high, 60 feet high. Yeah. Jerry? Okay, sir.
Did I miss the numbers at the beginning? How many did die in the war?
Here's the estimate. The official numbers from our Pentagon today, as well as from people like Gordon Wood, the eminent historian from Brown. He's the dean of all revolutionary scholars. So your first day in your doctoral program, when they say revolution, they give you Gordon Wood's books and say, read it. If anybody saw Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck are debating Gordon Wood. So
He spoke in your place there, right?
Oh, Gordon did? Was he great?
He was great.
I'm a big fan of his. He was helpful with the book, by the way. He supported the book. Who haven't you had here? Yeah. So I'm in the shadows of giants. Well, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel now. I apologize. I'm sad that the literary festival has just gone. But at any rate, even Gordon gives these numbers. The official numbers we estimate in the maybe 4,600 to 6,000 range. That's how many men died in combat during the Revolutionary War. Now another 20,000 died of disease, but 4,600 to 6,000 died in combat. Remember, you would have an army of 300 against an army of 800. You'd have 20 casualties, they exchanged musket fire, and then they went home. So it was a different kind of war. 11,500 died on this ship. That's the best guess. Now, here's the way to look at it. That's twice as many men that died on that one ship and died in combat on the entirety of the war, 1775 to 1783. Here's another way to look at it. The number of men that died on that ship, that's the population of New York, Boston, and Philly, our 3 biggest cities. That would be akin today to the entire population of New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago dying in one prison camp in ISIS or something. So the numbers are mind-boggling from a relative perspective. Let me get one more, Jerry.
I was just wondering if some of these bones were exhumed, whether or not through forensic science, you could find, I mean, genealogists do this all the time, forensic genealogy, they'll be able to trace an ancestor to the present.
Yeah.
So you might be able to find ancestors or descendants.
Yeah, there could be descendants, there could be, we're gonna play hell actually identifying anything unless if it's through DNA samples from the bone marrow or core, whatever's left. We have the names of 7,000 prisoners, Sproat, and these guys checked them in. We're missing the names of thousands, but we have 7,000. I think there were 5 Watsons that were on board. I have no idea if it's, we know we were here during the Revolution, but who knows. The Brooklyn Naval Yard, I'll end with this. Evacuation Day, that's what they called it. That was in November of 1783. That's when the Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783 because of primitive communication, primitive transportation, and the British were prideful and angry. So in November of 1783, they left. They boarded ships and sailed back to England with their tails between their legs. In the months preceding that, they scrapped all the forts. They took all the old prison ships and scrapped them, sold timber, sold nails, sold everything. Everything but one, the ghost ship. When they sailed away, the last piece of real estate, the ghost ship was still sitting 100 yards off the coast. Now, without prisoners manning her bilge pumps 24/7, over the next subsequent days and weeks, she sunk down into the muck, where she was forgotten. They were renovating the Brooklyn Naval Yard, if anybody's been there. Wallabout, anybody familiar with New York City? Okay, so here's where it would be. If you're looking out at Wallabout Bay and looking across to southeastern Manhattan, lower eastern Manhattan, right to your left is the Brooklyn Bridge, right to your right is the Williamsburg Bridge, and there's the Wallabout Bay. When they were renovating the Brooklyn Naval Yard, guess what they found? Some nails and some old timbers in the spot. They found a couple pieces of pottery, porcelain, a cup. So I've been up there, we put on the white gloves, and they're now in the Brooklyn Historical Society. So I'm going back in about a month, and we're going to try to take the next step in this process with the support of the BHS, so that should be exciting. Oh, hang around if you want a book or you just want to chat. Thanks, and good luck with the rest of the Literary Festival. Thank you.
A stands for Americans who never will be slaves. B for Boston's bravery that ever freedom saves. C is for the Congress which though loyal will be free. D stands for defense against all force and tyranny. Stand firmly A to Z, we swear forever to